Here's part 3. This was much harder to write than I thought it would be. I'll post my conclusions in the morning. I'm exhausted now. Hope you enjoy. Despite Woody's concerns for our safety, he agreed to let us try again, and our third and what would be final probe into the mystery of Woody's haunting began with dinner at a restaurant in Warrenton by the name of Tippy's Taco House. Woody drove up and joined us. The place had really good food. We discussed the events of the previous 2 weeks in great depth. It was plain to all of us that whatever we were dealing with had a particular affinity for females, and we were willing to take Woody at his word when he said the phenomena was heaviest in the early spring. Certainly, we hadn't been disappointed thus far. Attempts had been made to research the property prior to Woody's ownership. It was indicated that the house that currently stood was at least the second time the site had been built on, probably more than that. We had no evidence of a death or anything heinous having occurred there, however, basically a dead end. So we just sat down and put logic to work. What happened in this area over the past few hundred years? Our first thought was the Civil War. We weren't too far from Manassas, where 2 battles had been fought. A little further in the other direction was Fredericksburg, another major battle site. There are numerous markers along major roads in our area with little historical tidbits about armies that passed through on their way to this battle or that. Undoubtedly, there was plenty of conflict and plenty of death in the history of our region. We'd had experiences with Civil War ghosts before, so it wasn't a stretch to consider that we had another. We thought about the Underground Railroad as well. Perhaps the ground the house was built on once held a way stop and something bad had happened. There was probably a Native American presence in the area in the earliest days. And then there was always the possibility it was an elemental, or worse, a demon. In other words, we didn't really know. To this day we still don't, though the events of the third and final night helped us narrow it down considerably. Kevin and I tried to convince the girls that they weren't going down this time. We argued about the apparent danger, reminded them of the effects of the previous 2 weeks had on them, but they invoked the power of the vagina and won the day. It was decided that all 4 of us, along with Woody himself, would descend that night. We geared up, 4 lanterns, 4 cameras, our 1 surviving recorder, and Woody had a few flashlights on hand should we need them. We waited till dusk and searched the premises. All was well, except for our batteries, which were once again dead. I came pretty close to calling the whole thing off when we discovered that. I've had a very active ghost hunting career, but I've never experienced 3 encounters in 3 weeks. Not once before this incident, and not once since. For at least a few minutes on this final night, I really did not want to go through it all again, but my ambition and love for my hobby kept my mouth shut. It was too good an opportunity to let pass by. We descended the steps in single file, and halfway down, all 4 lanterns sputtered and died. Momentary panic set in until Woody, who was bringing up the rear, turned back and flicked the switch on for the lights over the steps. We retreated to the top floor, where no amount of shaking or fiddling could get the lanterns lit again. These types of lanterns aren't battery powered. They have a bulb that lasts so long, and then you toss the thing and buy a new one. They're cheap. Unfortunately, all 4 of ours had just died, to the tune of about $80. They're not cheap in bulk, damn it. And we were reduced to Woody's flashlight collection. Once we sorted that mess out, we again descended the steps, acutely aware that we were not welcome. We all had a very uneasy feeling that night. It felt like all bets were off, and the dead lantern seemed to be a challenge, or a warning. Woody stood near the rack with the biggest flashlight. Sarah and I sat on the sawhorses while Kevin and Jenna waited near the steps. Each of us pairs had a flashlight between us. We decided that we wouldn't allow the girls to get more than a step away from the guys, and that we would frequently speak to them to make sure they weren't being fucked with. They related their feelings immediately. Dread, anger, resentment. Jenna told us the basement felt different to her this time though, very melancholy. She was convinced something tragic had happened here, but couldn't tell if it was a malicious tragedy, an accident, or what. As I've mentioned, she makes no claim to being psychic, and says she was just interpreting what she felt. We waited in the dark for a bit. We made some small talk now and again, mostly checking up on the girls and asking for their feelings. Nothing happened for about the first 2 hours. At that point, we heard the faint tapping. It came from the same place as the previous times, and again we lit the area, saw nothing, and took a bunch of pictures. that would show us nothing when developed. The tapping faded away after about 20 minutes, and the minutes dragged by. Jenna and Sarah maintained that they were in control of themselves, though they felt the emotional disturbance very intensely. As for us guys, we felt nothing but creeping dread on the back of our necks. I'd say another hour passed, putting us past midnight and into Sunday morning, May 19th. 2 quick taps preceded a sudden, and I mean fucking sudden, drop in temperature. That was immediately followed by a loud thump, right next to where Kevin and Jenna stood. It sounded like something heavy jumping off the steps onto the basement floor. Kevin and Jenna, thoroughly freaked, backpedaled to the sawhorses where Sarah and I stood. All 3 flashlight beams immediately blazed out at the bottom of the steps, and just as quickly dimmed to the point of barely providing any illumination at all. This was probably the most oh fuck moment I've ever had in my life up until that point. Something else would top it a few seconds later, though. We all began babbling at once. We were in the dark. It was freezing cold, and there was something fucking around with our flashlights. I raised my voice, telling everyone to shut up and hold still. Let's carry this through to the end and blah blah blah. What I wanted to do was fucking bolt. I held my ground, and so did the rest of them. We heard the sound of dragging feet. I hadn't heard it prior to this, and it gave me the impression of someone in a great deal of pain slowly slogging his or her way across the basement. It moved with agonizing slowness. A 3-legged turtle could have moved faster. Of course, time always slows down during an oh fuck moment, so maybe my perception was just screwed up. Kevin jerked Jenna back over near the stairs to watch and listen. I could hear them and the others breathing very heavily beneath the sound. It followed the same path Kevin had described it taking, from the steps across the first half of the basement to the rack. Woody still had some of the badass Marine in him. He held his ground as it went right past him, through the opening to the second half where the sawhorses were. Sarah and I were pretty much rooted to the spot, even with this thing bearing down on us. We stared in the direction it was coming, the pitiful remnant of our flashlight barely illuminating the space a foot in front of us. It shuffled up next to us, and I don't want to say it materialized because it didn't. It was just there. It had clear, distinct legs, colorless as ghosts tend to be, I guess, but not transparent like some supposedly are. It wore what I can only call old-timey looking shoes, with socks or stockings that ended just below the knee. Above that was just whiteness. I got the impression that it was covered in a sheet or perhaps wrapped in a cloak or cape. One thing's for sure, it had a hugely swollen belly. I think it was very, very pregnant. At chest level, it began to become very indistinct, and it had no shoulders, neck, or head. I'm not saying it had been decapitated, just that for whatever reason it didn't manifest itself above the chest. It's hard to describe how the thing looked up top. You know how artists rough out a basic sketch of something they're drawing and then add detail and polish until it looks like it should? That's the best way to describe this thing above the chest. It was like an artist roughed it out but didn't finish it. There was no tapering to where the neck should be, just white streaks that continued up well above where the head would be. It was only there about 5 seconds, but it really felt like an eternity. I know that's cliche to say, but it's true. I just stared at it. I was aware of how god-awful cold it was in the room, and vaguely aware of the other 4 people there with me gawking at this thing. I remember being thankful that it had no eyes, and I felt a profound sense of achievement. I'd waited my whole life to see a ghost. I'd heard plenty of them prior to this. I'd felt their presence, but I'd never seen one. It wasn't as thrilling as I thought it would be, though. More than anything, I felt a deep, unrelenting sorrow for whoever or whatever this was. But behind those feelings were words of warning. Unfriendly. Unclean. Wrong. It faded away. Only took a couple of seconds, but it did so much slower than it appeared. Sarah and I felt something disturb the air running past us towards the steps, but Kevin and Jenna, who were standing at the bottom of said steps, felt nothing. When it was gone, our lights blazed back to full brightness, and we fucking panicked like we had never panicked before. It played out much like the first night, except this time nobody had their heads together enough to calm the rest of us down. We ended up on the front lawn, panting and trembling, and slowly we were gaining control of ourselves. I think we all wanted to talk it over, but we kept it short, preferring to stick to our rule of waiting until the next morning after some sleep and breakfast to debrief ourselves and start work on our official report. It was about 1:30 on the morning of the 19th when we left Woody's house. He told us he'd be okay alone. He's a tough old bastard and knew that there was nothing wrong with the house besides the basement, so we all went home and fell asleep. There's some suggestions most ghost hunters make to people who are interested in trying it out for the first time. Talk to the ghosts. It sounds silly, but what you're supposed to do when you arrive on site is explain to the ghosts who you are, what you're doing there, and politely ask them to allow their pictures to be taken. You're also supposed to make it very clear to them when you leave that they are not permitted to follow you home. That they must remain where they are in the name of Jesus or whoever you wish to invoke. Despite the cheesiness of it, our team does that before and after every hunt. I'm not convinced it works though. I woke at about 4 a.m. that same night. My TV switched on by itself. A few minutes later, my phone rang. Sarah, in a panic, her TV had done likewise. The next morning, we confirmed the same thing had happened to Kevin and Jenna, but not to Woody. And every fucking May 19th since, my TV has turned itself on at some point during the night while I sleep. Same thing happens to the rest of my team. I switch it off and go back to bed. Nothing else the least bit paranormal has ever happened to me outside of my ghost hunts, but I think you can understand that given the apparently hostile nature of the ghost we were dealing with, I don't like it. Such are the risks of ghost hunting, I guess.